In our last conversations with Dr. Nicole Rizzuto, we started to see a pattern. Dead lesbian syndrome showed us how queer women are raced on screen. The lavender scare showed us how state enforced sexual conformity in real life. And if you zoom out, both of those stories point to the same question. Who decides what's normal and what happens if you don't fit in? Today, we're going deeper into the system of it all, the blueprint that makes those patterns possible. And that's why I'm so excited to welcome back cultural historian Dr. Nicole Rizzuto. Dr. Rizzuto's work sits at the intersection of queer history, culture, and power. But what makes her perspective so sharp is how she connects those big ideas to real life. She earned her PhD in history and culture from Drew University, teaches women's studies and queer history at St. Xavier University in Chicago, and works for Point Foundation, the nation's largest LGBTQ+ scholarship organization. So she's not just studying these systems, she's actively shaping the next generation navigating them. In addition, she is also a New Jersey native whose worldview is a mixture of Springsteen, leftist politics, and just enough chaos to keep everything interesting, which honestly feels so right for this conversation. Dr. Nicole Rizzuto, welcome back.
I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you so much for doing this again. Always appreciate your insight and brilliance. So let's get into this comp het because it is got me stirring. Just even like talking through like the intro itself, I was just like, whoa, like I'm reverting back to like my teen and young adult years where I was just like trying to figure out myself and like, why am I not straight? Why am I not this? And I think this actually explains a lot of that. And I think it'll be really enlightening for a lot of people who didn't even know this concept actually existed. So excited to dig into it. So would love to start off with my first question to you. Across the last few episodes together, we looked at different enforcement mechanisms, fiction that punishes queer women for existing, a government that purged gay employees as national security threats. Comp het feels like an ideological engine underneath both of those, the thing that made them culturally legible in the first place. When Adrienne Rich published in 1980, she was writing for a specific academic and activist audience, and now the term is shorthand as comp het on social media and many other forums. What gets lost in translation and what gets surprisingly gained in that process?
Yeah, I think we've all kind of embraced the phrase comp het as a way to describe the different ways in which society pushes us into this blueprint, right? And the blueprint is like, grow up, find a nice spouse of the other gender, get married, have babies, raise those babies, and send those babies on to do the exact same thing that you did, right? And while that is happening, also work for the government so that you can, produce money and capital for other people. And I think that the blueprint is super comforting. And the shorthand of comp het allows us to be like, this is why we do the things that we do. This is why we feel compelled to find a man before we graduate high school, right? And this is like why we feel compelled to get married and have babies and move forward. I think when Adrienne Rich wrote her article in 1980, she was looking specifically at women. And I think that's one of the things that gets lost when we talk about comp het. I think the cool thing about Adrienne Rich's article was that it was published in 1980, but then it was published again in 1983 in a book called Powers of Desire. It's published in the same anthology as Capitalism and the Gay Identity, which John D'Amelio wrote. And I think a lot of the time we smush those two articles together when we're talking about comp het, right? Because D'Amelio was talking about how capitalism invented the nuclear family, and in inventing the nuclear family, it also created the opposite of like the gay identity and the queer identity and like not being part of the nuclear family and going out and figuring out life by yourself. So that is what social media is talking about when they say comp het, right? They're not talking about the lesbian continuum that Adrienne Rich was writing about. They're not talking about like the need to center women-centric friendships and like keeping your life super focused on women. The concept of comp het in social media is very much society forced me to be heterosexual, which is part of what Adrienne Rich is saying, but it's not her main argument. Her main argument is that we need to decenter men. She was talking about decentering men in 1980. This was a very important part of her life. She had been married to a man. She divorced the man. She got into a lesbian relationship. But even her lesbian relationship wasn't the center of her universe. The center of her universe was her friendships. And I think one of the things that we forget when we're reading Adrienne Rich in 2026 is that most of her friends were Black womanists who were queer themselves and who were pushing for like this intersectional understanding of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a queer woman and what it means to reject what society wants you to be as a queer Black woman. So when Adrienne is writing this article, she's not necessarily thinking, I want to explain why all women feel compelled to be heterosexual. She's instead saying, we need to problematize this belief that heterosexuality is inevitable. And instead, we need to raise children to value women. And especially, we need to raise young girls to value their friendships and relationships with women, regardless of whether or not those friendships are sexual, regardless of whether or not those relationships are romantic, right? More so, we are so centered on making men happy that we internalize that and we focus all of our energy on making men happy instead of, building friendships with women that are going to sustain us from, that first breakup through our time in the nursing home. So I think that's the big difference between social media and what Adrienne Rich was actually writing. In social media, we're talking about how queer people feel pushed into heteronormativity to make our parents happy and society happy and to feel like we belong. What Adrienne Rich was actually writing about, which is little girls need to depend on other little girls, women need to depend on other women to find happiness and connection and security because men aren't going to provide it.
Right. That makes sense. And I'm curious, like in your experience of like understanding compet, like what was your reaction to learning about this and kind of having the words to describe like unlearning what compulsory heterosexuality is and just kind of shattering that paradigm that was, brainwashed into all of us?
I read this article for the first time in high school because I wrote a thesis on it my junior year of high school because I was pretentious and precocious and was like, I'm going to do something gay. And so reading it at 16, when I had broken up with my first girlfriend a few months before and I was dating a man at that time, I think it felt like the article itself felt like condemnation. Like I had made a bad choice as a woman to date a man, even though like it was a healthy relationship and he treated me really well. Like I was failing as a feminist because I chose to date a man instead of, choosing to be a political lesbian. The term itself felt affirming in a way because it is frustrating, especially as a teenage girl, especially in the early 2000s, right? Because we went from Disney princesses to all those rom-coms, like all those ridiculous rom-coms that were forced down our throats. And at the time, I was really coming to terms with the fact that like I didn't like any of the women in those rom-coms. I didn't want to be them. I didn't want to date the men that they were dating. Like the only one that I liked was 10 Things I Hate About You. And that was that was Shakespearean. It wasn't even really a rom-com written in the 21st century. So having the phrase felt important. Honestly, John D'Amelio's essay meant more to me at that time because it allowed me to see how heteronormativity reinforces capitalism and why the two of them are intrinsically linked and how pushing back against compulsory heterosexuality allows me to build my own community and reject the seduction of capitalism and reject the concept that like, oh, I can be a millionaire because that's not what I actually want. Even if I was a millionaire, that's not a goal that I actually have. And at 16, I was like, I don't need to follow this blueprint. I can make my romantic life look whatever I want it to look like. I can make my friendships look like whatever I want them to look like. And again, I was reading it in a vacuum. I didn't have social media. Like no one was talking about this. So I didn't have the social media like illusion of what was going on. I very much had like, this is how I'm interpreting what Adrienne Rich is writing. And for me, the lesbian continuum meant more because it allowed me to be like, oh, as long as I continue to care about and center women, I'm still making the choice to be queer politically at the very least.
Right. And on that topic of D'Amelio's article, so like you said, he argued that capitalism created gay identity while simultaneously using the nuclear family as an ideological anchor, and that was in 1983. And we now have gig work, we have delayed milestones, rainbow branded everything, so i.e. rainbow capitalism. In your opinion, do you think we are more free or are we just marketed differently?
I don't think any of us can consider ourselves free until gender affirming healthcare is readily available to all of our trans siblings. And I don't think we can consider ourselves free until misogyny is no longer impacting every queer woman in America. And I don't think we can consider ourselves free until we eradicate homophobia in every community. And like, as long as homophobia continues to exist, then no, we're not free. I don't think there's a phrase, you should not argue in inches of evil. I think that's Ayn Rand, which is embarrassing, but I think it's her. And I think that we have to do the same with liberation. Like, we can't argue in inches of liberation. Either we're free or we're not. And rainbow capitalism is, if anything, a drug for the masses, right? It's a way to keep us compliant. It's a way to force assimilation. It's a way to make us feel like we belong, as long as we fit into the boxes of what queerness is supposed to look like for the heterosexual community. Like, as long as we fulfill the role of like the gay best friend who's super sassy and fun, and as long as we like fulfill the role of the feminist killjoy and every lesbian is like alone with her cats in a small room, like as long as we hit those stereotypes, then people are okay with us to an extent. But we also have seen with the current administration that the moment it gets hard to be an ally, everyone will roll back that allyship. And Target, I think, is the best example. When they came out with their Pride collection last year, it was beige. I can't think of any queer in the entire world who's like, let me wear beige. That choice by Target aligns with their other choices to roll back their anti-racist initiatives and to completely ignore the fact that their trans employees exist. And so as long as we recognize, as Audre Lorde taught us, that like all of our liberations are interconnected, we need to constantly be fighting for freedom for everyone if we ever want to consider ourselves free.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think also, just like to that point, it's like all of these different forms of like discrimination, racial, gender, sexual orientation, ability, all these things are meant to centralize power to the patriarchal hegemonic society. And in order to dismantle that, in order for us to progress as a society, all of that has to be eradicated. And I have hope that it can be, but I also am understanding too of like the amount of conditioning that people have been fed from childhood through the communities that they grow up in, that they still are participating in, that like, that is a tall order to accomplish. You know what I mean? And do you have any hope that that can happen, or do you have any theories of how that could happen in our society, I guess?
I think, one of the things that we're taught as any marginalized group is that if we get a seat at the table, we're supposed to make the table longer, right? We're supposed to make sure that other people can get a seat at the table. You're supposed to walk through the door and then hold the door open for the next person to walk through. I was raised Catholic, which was a thing. I was raised Catholic, and there's a lot of trauma here. And I'm not Catholic anymore.
For sure.
But I think one of the most illustrative stories for me was that Jesus didn't walk into the temple and sit down at the table and talk about why collecting taxes on Sunday was a bad idea. He wasn't like, let me talk to these tax collectors and argue my stance as a Jewish man who thinks that this is wrong. He walked in and he flipped the table. Like, he walked in and he said, not in my Father's house, and he flipped the table. And I think that what we need is more people willing to flip tables and not necessarily sit down at them with people who don't think that we should have the right to exist. Conversation's important. Dialectic is important. I fully believe in educating as many people as possible and hoping to change their minds. But I also think that at the end of the day, if someone is denying the right for queer and trans people to exist, we just have to flip the table and move from there. And I believe that the next generation and the generation after that are more willing to flip tables. But then I look at like stats around how many Zoomer men believe in conservatism, and I'm like, well, maybe we're just swinging backwards. Like, maybe there's a reactionary force that's bigger than all of the work millennials did to try to burn the blueprint. Maybe these kids, are scared of not having a blueprint, and they're just clinging to whatever trad wife fantasy they can cling to because they don't want to have to do it by themselves. So.
Yeah, I literally, on that topic of marriage, I think like looking at it from the queer lens of like marriage equality, which was a genuine victory for our community, which was great. I think it did a lot of great things in increasing our rights as, citizens, which what a groundbreaking thing to have equal rights as everybody else. Crazy, right? But what I think it also did, though, is that it set a new set of expectations that queer people should want to marry, that they should want domesticity, that they should perform normalcy now that it's available to them. And I guess my question to you is, how does Compet operate inside queer communities through homonormativity? And what does it look like when we enforce it on each other? Because I think that is something that does happen in wanting to be like the right queer, the right kind of queer person, right?
Yeah, I will always be a huge fan of Sarah Schulman. I met her last summer and it was like meeting
Nice.
Beyonce for you. Like it was everything.
I love it. I love it.
And one of her more recent books, I think it came out in like 2012, was called Gentrification of the Mind. And she looks at how like Greenwich Village, Alphabet City gentrified. And I'm not saying that in like, middle class queer showed up and started getting married and having babies, although that was the end game, right? But it was more that people who grew up, and by grow up, I mean like you show up in New York at 17 unhoused and you build your life. And by like the time you're 30, hopefully you have a network that allows you to exist without survival sex work. Those people who grew up around radical ideology in their 40s and 50s were assimilating into what we now call homonormativity, right? They wanted the marriage, they wanted like the babies. And there's nothing wrong with marriage and babies. You are married. I got married in December. Like these are things that exist.
Congrats.
Thanks. But it declaws us as a movement, right? Like marriage equality was definitely a declawing of our fight for healthcare, because the argument for most of the 80s and the 90s was like invest in healthcare for people living with HIV, invest in research against HIV. Like we need the government to care about our lives. And in the same way that the LGBTQ community likes to pretend that HIV didn't exist until 1981, like our unhoused siblings were dying of HIV in the 60s and 70s. They just didn't have any sort of political power, so they didn't matter, right? And we didn't start caring about the deadliness of HIV until middle-class white gay men were dying. And I think in recent years, especially with marriage equality, there has been a push for the rest of the LGBTQ community to move towards white middle-class gay culture as much as possible. And in doing that, we're losing a lot of our revolutionary spirit. We're losing our emphasis on found families, which is how we survived for like centuries at this point. Centuries of queers survived because of found families, right? Like I'm talking about the 1700s, where gay men would go to Molly houses and they would, form community with trans individuals, and they would, form community with themselves, and they would have conversations, and they would fight for more freedom in England in the 1700s. And then, we moved towards like the ballroom scene of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and how we built community there. And if we all just want to be married with 2 kids and a golden retriever, we're losing everything that makes us queer, and we're just becoming people who like having sex with the same gender. And that's not what the LGBT community is. Like queerness is a revolution. Queerness has always been a revolution. It's always been about queering the norms and making sure that the margins are wider so that we can accept more and more people. And as we move towards homonormativity and we move towards this like vision of being married with 2 kids and a golden retriever in a pretty house with a white picket fence, we are losing our trans siblings. We are losing our Black and Indigenous and Latina and Asian siblings, because they can't assimilate in the same ways that I can, right? Like it's not a thing that they can do. I'm especially bitter about this as a bisexual woman, because I'm like, everyone my entire life has been like, why don't you just marry him? Like, you like men, why don't you just marry a man and have babies and live that life? And it's because my thing has always been, it's important to make space for everyone else. And I'm going to live my life on my terms so that people who have less privilege than I do can live their lives on their terms. And as we move towards homonormativity, the people who have the most privilege in the LGBTQ community are abandoning the people who have less privilege than us, inch by inch.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I just going back to your earlier point too, of like the decline of the movement that we had and marriage equality. I think we lost a lot of people in like that fight, because it felt like such a galvanizing moment for a lot of people to overturn DOMA and overturn Prop 8 and all that kind of good stuff, that like, I feel like there was a shift where people celebrated. They were so joyful. They're like, this is a big moment for us. And then it's like, people like, okay, that's enough. And there's still so much more, like you said, around healthcare that still needs to be addressed. And I just feel like we lost a lot of momentum, I think, in the community after that had happened, that I feel like we still need to get back. And I think there's some people are kind of re-engaging now after like this regressive regime that we're currently under. But I think to your point, though, it's like with losing that collective goal, we lost some of that collective power in the process, which I think is really frustrating because there's still so much that we have to upend and subvert in order to have a society that actually functions for all people and all the people that are the most marginalized specifically. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think also too, like, I have hope. I have hope that we will get to a point where we can have that same level of excitement and passion around whatever we need to as a community to move ourselves forward as a society. We'll see if that happens. But I think, given how many people are affected by all that's happening right now in this country, that we can get there. But again, that's very optimistic, obviously, and very, hopefully not naive, but we'll see. We'll see. But, want to kind of pivot the conversation now and talk a little bit about respectability politics and what is considered good queerness, right? So Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, she writes about respectability politics as a strategy marginalized communities have used to gain acceptance by aligning with dominant norms, kind of the behavioral norms and presentation and morality and all that kind of good stuff. And my question to you is, do you see a version of that playing out in queer community today? What does respectable queerness look like, and who gets rewarded and excluded by those standards?
Higginbotham was writing about middle-class Black communities in the early 20th century. And her argument was very much that, like, the middle class believed the road to acceptance by white society was to accept European standards of like gender and sexuality and economic standards and like dress and speech and everything, right? It was finding ways to create a Black middle class that, for the most part, could be separate but equal to the white middle class. So having the same type of clubs just for Black people. So like having Train Club and having like a women's society. I think one of the best examples of this is Nella Larsen's Passing, where you see these two middle class, very light-skinned Black women who, one chooses to pass as white and marry a white man and live her life basically posing as a white woman. And she is seen as the villain throughout the novel, right? She tries to steal the main character's husband. They might have been having the main character and the woman who was passing might have been having sex. We don't really get an answer on that because Nella was in the closet. Mm-hmm. But also the main character is shown as a good light-skinned Black woman because she marries a Black man. She lives in Harlem, right? She has Black community, but she's also very proper. She has a maid who does all of her work. She, lives in a world that is very like focused on volunteer work and charity. And she basically has accepted all of the trappings of middle-class whiteness as a Black woman. When it comes to respectability politics within queer communities, I think one of the ways that we see that playing out internationally is the LGBT without the T movement in England, which is very much It's okay to be queer, but it's not okay to be trans. And we're not going to recognize our trans siblings. We're just going to fight for marriage equality, basically. And it's like workplace protections for queer people. I think we see this a lot when it comes to the there was an article, I believe in the Washington Post a few months ago, that looked at all of and really honed in on how they act and dress and look just like all of their straight compatriots, and yet they go home to a man at the end of the day instead of going home to a woman. It is not just that the society sees them as just like straight people, just married to a man. It's more that they see themselves as just like straight people, but married to a man. And that takes away from so much of what it means to be queer, which is very much like free love and the concept of being able to move into like polyamorous relationships or ethical non-monogamy. It also takes away from like building families that aren't rooted in romance and getting rid of the romance myth and really focusing on like, 20 years ago, being gay meant living in an apartment with 5 other gay men and trying to make your pay your bills and make ends meet. And now we're looking at it as, you can be just like everybody else and married, and it's going to be all of your dreams come true. They're taking the Disney princess myth and just having Aladdin marry Jafar instead of Jasmine. You haven't done anything. You haven't like broken down all of the systems that are hurting everyone else. We're just buying into oppressive systems. And at the end of the day, making more room for a very select number of queer people at the very, very top isn't doing anything progressive. We're not saving the world just because there are gay men who are serving as the Secretary of Transportation. That's not radical. I think right now, this idea that like heated rivalry is going to save us because so many gay people get to see themselves represented by hockey players. And isn't it great that we're showing, queer hockey players on international television? Yeah, it's great, I guess. But like the men's hockey team at the Olympics still partied with the FBI director and called
Correct.
were misogynist towards the women's team. So like, did heated rivalry fix anything? No, absolutely not. Like it didn't make any of the queer hockey players that exist today come out. It's not like, a bunch of NHL players were like, hey, I'm also gay. They didn't do that. They're ignoring the fact that it exists. A world where like the lesbians are cheerleaders, which is like, yes, lesbians are cheerleaders sometimes, but that should not be the representation that we're aiming for because many lesbians are not the cheerleaders. Many gay men are not beautiful and sexy and acceptable by straight society. Like we need to, if we're going to follow in the footsteps of our queer elders, we need to be constantly pushing the margins of what's acceptable and not assimilating to what straight people tell us is acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And even on that like hidden rivalry note, I totally agree that like it is still very much, it feels very steeped in just like heteronormativity. It's a highly masculinized sport. It is the most digestible form of queerness that could be presented to such a wide audience. And obviously that's why it worked, right? And why it was successful. And there are, queer people of color who often are pushed to the margins that aren't represented not nearly enough across media and society. Scholars like Audre Lorde and Maddie Eudora Richardson, whose work centers the erotic and sexual anatomy of Black queer women, reminds us that compet doesn't land the same for everybody. And looking at just like the intersection of culture, so race, class, gender, they all have different scripts, different pressures, and different costs for deviating from the norms of society. My question to you is, can you talk about how those intersections complicate the picture and whose experiences tend to get flattened when mainstream conversations focus narrowly on sexual orientation?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I haven't seen any articles about the feminization of the Asian character on Heated Rivalry.
Right.
And also the ways in which the other romance, the one with the barista, so not the main romance, but like my wife did make
Kip
me watch
and the other guy.
She did make me watch it. Yes. I watched it. But like, the love interest, not the hockey player, but the barista is very much like written as if he is this very submissive, like artsy, feminized gay man to partner with the hyper-masculine hockey player. And we see that again and again and again. And then Shane and Ilya, see, I know their names. Shane and Ilya are both seen as being like passing because like they're able to be in these hyper-masculine spaces and pass as straight, which is important for them to keep their jobs as far as they're concerned.
Right.
And I think one of the things that we ignore when we are only talking about sexuality is the fact that each race is compelled by white supremacy to perform gender in different ways, right? Like we all know about the hypermasculinization of Black women, which I think for our generation is most exemplified by everyone saying that Michelle Obama was a man. And so like we know that Black women are constantly pushing back against this stereotype that they're masculinized. And that's hard, especially for the stud community, because you have this like your parents, your loved ones are like, be less like a man because everyone thinks Black women are manly. So you're playing into that stereotype. Don't do that. And it's a constant tension. I think in cultures where machismo is very prevalent, we don't talk enough about how being queer in those spaces is different from being queer in white spaces. Because I think one of the things that Rich really hones in on is the fact that white men, she's not really talking about, well, she does mention Black women a bit, but like her argument is that men, which we can assume she's saying white men, when they are gay, they don't have to perform anything to be taken seriously at work, right? Like you can just be a single man working on the factory floor and people are just like, oh, old Tim, he just never found a woman to settle down with. And old Tim can like, you know, passingly mention that he went to a musical last weekend with his sister and people don't like, they might look at you side eye for a second, but you can move on from that. For queer women, especially if we're looking at the mid 20th century, like many queer women would go to work wearing a dress and heels and their hair perfectly coiffed and like curls and everything, full face of makeup. And then on the way to the club, dip into a public restroom, because we had those back then, and like wash off their face, pull back their hair, do a little duck's ass hair thing, and put on their slacks and their loafers because they were butch at heart, but they couldn't perform butchness in the company that they worked for. Women are expected to perform femininity, and not just femininity, but also interest in men the whole time. And what does that look like for like an Asian woman who has been hypersexualized throughout history because they are seen as like geishas and sex workers in the Korean and the Thai context. And so a queer Asian woman is forced to look even more sexualized than her white compatriots. We're not having those conversations. We're not talking about how gender exists for different people. I think a Black queer history of the United States was published last year. And that book really looks into how, in order to assimilate into white society, middle-class Black culture made the choice to accept European gender and sexual standards. And that meant constantly policing against any Black person or Black community that accepted anything other than the norm, right? And so like Pauline Murray doesn't get the amazing like recognition by history that they deserve because they were a genderqueer person who looked into taking testosterone for the first like half of their life and lived openly in a lesbian relationship. And we know that like when Bayard Rustin was arrested by the police for being queer, the Black community that was pushing for civil rights pushed him out of all of his positions of power. He was no longer allowed to lead any of the civil rights organizations that he was a part of. He was supposed to just like stay in the corner while Martin Luther King Jr. talked because being queer was seen as too much of a problem and it wouldn't allow for Black people to gain acceptance. And we don't talk enough about that when we're talking about Comp Het. We're constantly looking at Comp Het through the lens of white Christian middle-class existence without thinking about how it impacts every other type of person.
The next thing I wanted to chat through is a point that you had a little bit earlier around found family. D'Amelio's closing argument is that liberation requires building what he calls affectional communities, which we now call either chosen families or found families. But what we're also seeing with that is that chosen family or found family is being commercialized and co-opted by, you know, corporations, mass media. What does genuine unlearning look like practically and not theoretically? And how do we know when you're building something new versus recreating the same structures of queer drag?
I think we live in a society in which it's hard to fully break free of the mold, right? I mean, one of the most iconic lines in D'Amelio's essay is capitalism is the problem. Like, capitalism is the problem. Until we get rid of that, there's really no space in which to push away the confines of capitalism, which dictates everything that we do, right? Like, capitalism dictates white supremacy, it dictates misogyny, it dictates transphobia. Until we get rid of the capitalism, those three things are always going to exist, and they're always going to impact us in various ways. And everyone, right? It impacts everyone. It impacts me, like transphobia impacts me as a cisgender woman. White supremacy impacts me as a white woman. Like, these things don't not impact me just because I live in a spectrum of, like, I live on the privileged side of that spectrum.
Right.
How do we unlearn the things that are hurting us the most? I think a lot of that comes down to living in community. Our found families, our chosen families for, you know, generations were very much interracial found families. They were very much interclass found families. I think a lot of the stories that you read about from queer people, I mean, both oral histories and fiction that was being written at the time in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, you see these stories of like very rich people losing everything when they come out to their families or giving up everything when they choose to move to New York City to live their lives authentically. And looking at that from the perspective of 2026, we might be like, well, they're giving up privilege that they shouldn't be giving up, and that's not ethical. But in the 1950s and 1960s, it was very common to see people who came from, the middle class, the upper classes, leaving that life to go live in Alphabet City and struggling in a bohemian lifestyle. And they chose to live with working class people. They chose to live with, Black people in the city. For many of them, it was their first exposure to people of color. And they made the decision that if they were marginalized as queer people, they were going to connect with people of color as marginalized groups. And we see that in like Giovanni's room specifically, where we see like the white, well, he was American versus Italian, but like the Italian character, Giovanni, stands in for Baldwin's own experiences as a Black man living in Paris and like what it meant to build community with white Parisians as a Black American at that time. And we just have to build more community that is, cross-racial, cross-class. Like, what does it mean to create found families that are rooted in revolutionary politics and not demographics without ignoring our differences? I think Audre Lorde really tells us over and over and over again throughout her various essays that community needs to celebrate our differences. It can't downplay our differences. It can't ignore our differences. This is not about whitewashing our differences. It's about learning to embrace and love all of the differences in our found families. And that is, I think, where the true unlearning is. When we're in conversation with people who are marginalized in ways that are different from the ways that we are marginalized, we start to understand how the nexus of oppression impacts all of us. And we're able to see that all liberation is interconnected. And those conversations are where we figure out how to create new tools that will dismantle the master's house, right? We can't live in these echo chambers where all of like everyone in your found family is white and middle class and think that we're going to create revolutionary tools that can overthrow and destroy the master's house. We need to be talking about the different perspectives that we have and the different goals that we have and the different visions of what freedom is, so that we can start to imagine and then build a world that is completely different from the one that we live in, that will allow for the liberation of all people. You can read as many books as you want. Like, I can quote Lorde, I can quote Hooks, I can do that, but it's not until you're living in community with people who are marginalized in ways that are different than you that you start to understand how all marginalization is rooted in capitalism and rooted in white supremacy and rooted in transphobia and rooted in misogyny, and how those things impact every single person, even if you are a straight white man who is cisgender and middle class and Christian. Like, we all feel those tensions. And I get that there is a fear that feminism will free men first. It was a feminist in the 1980s, though, who wrote an article called "The Fear That Feminism Will Free Men First." And it is like this fear that as we create more equal systems, men will get more freedom and more liberation. And I'm like, okay, maybe we should free men. Men are dealing with a lot right now. Like, y'all are going through a lot. Your whole loneliness epidemic. Like, you need friends. Talk to each other. Stop playing video games. I don't know. Pick up basketball. Great idea. But like, I have one man in my women and gender studies class this semester. I'm doing intro to women's studies. I have one man in the class. And there are moments where I'm like, you need feminism in your life, babe. Like, you just need feminism. You just need to like embrace the idea that you're allowed to cry. You need to embrace the idea that you're allowed to have close friendships. Like, it's okay to tell your buddies that you're sad about your ex-girlfriend and not just write about it in your morning reflections to me, because I can't comfort you. So go tell your friends that you're sad about your ex-girlfriend, and maybe they'll offer you comfort, and then you'll feel less alone. I think one of the things we need to remember is that everyone needs more freedom. Like, none of us are free right now. Capitalism traps all of us. And the only way to find freedom is to overthrow that system. I feel like I get really leftist on your podcast. I'm so sorry.
I love it though. I love it. And I think we need this conversation. We need these discussions. And it's like, that is honestly, I'm baiting you into to giving me these takes, because these are the takes that we need to hear, because they're not said anywhere else at the end of the day. And it's like, in my opinion, I think they're right. I think that's exactly what we have to do in order to push this forward. But on that note, thank you so much, Dr. Rizzuto. This concludes our Deep Space Dive.